Hello, listeners. I hope everyone is doing very well this week. This week's episode is going to have a look at some differences in thinking around things we take for granted as truths, but are only localized. I'll then try to draw a tenuous link to fitness to keep everybody happy. I also want to apologize. I have a bit of a cold, so I've got that kind of husky voice thing going on. So, there's an account I follow on Instagram, which is purely for amusement purposes. I could literally spend the rest of the episodes of this podcast just debunking their daily claims. I do find it curious, though, that an account that basically posts mistruths with no evidence whatsoever, because it's not possible to have evidence for something that's false. But this mistruth, fitness, wellness account, and others that I know of, has over 100,000 followers. And the videos that they post up, again, making claims that have no basis, have tens of thousands of views. And many philosophers right now are claiming that we live in an era that they're referring to as post-truth. And I would agree with this claim and argue that this has been brought about by societal megatrends such as social media. According to figures from Ofcom, which is the UK's Office for Communications, 67% of those aged between 16 and 44 now get their news from social media. 56% of all age groups get their news from Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And what is most frightening of all, though, is that of those surveyed that get their news from social media, so 56%, only 40% of those said that they were concerned that it was accurate information. No wonder we live in a post-truth era if we've got, almost half of the population of the country not caring whether or not the information they're receiving is accurate. It does become very difficult, though, because I don't think the education system itself has been set up to teach young people how to think. Now, be careful what you're hearing me say there, because I'm not saying what to think, but how to think. And by that, I mean nobody's taught deductive logic at school, right? How to analyze sources for validity. And where is it being taught to dig deeper before you hit the share button, right? It used to be taught, and my research for this episode tells me that logic and rhetoric, which came from Aristotle, which is ethos, pathos, and logos, which is, like an appeal to authority, appeal to emotionality, and then logos is logic or just facts, really. Now, these things were all phased out of the education system because it wasn't really easy to standardize the testing in someone's ability to create an argument using rhetoric. And I can see that being quite challenging. How do you standardize someone's ability to argue a claim and then defend that claim? But I'm not sure that dropping it entirely was a good idea, because every single day I see mistruths being shared. Some people with hundreds of thousands or even over 1 million followers can just hit share and spread this information to their acolytes, who in turn hit share, and then suddenly, more and more people have false knowledge. There's more false knowledge out there potentially than there is true knowledge now. Plato would probably be turning in his grave. So this week, anyway, I decided that, and there is a tie-in here, I promise. I decided that I wanted to have some smoked salmon and scrambled eggs for my breakfast. So I went out to the grocery store to get some. And you would think, considering it's famous for the product, that it would be super easy to find smoked salmon in Scotland, right? Now, I was about to discover something highly unusual. So I went to the fish aisle in the grocery store and picked up literally the most bougie-looking packet that was on there, because that's the kind of guy I am. However, I'm also the kind of guy that believes in using my eyeballs to read what things say. And amongst the word salad on this packet about, award-winning Scottish oak smoked and all this nonsense, it says farmed. Now, that was interesting to me because every single packet I picked up, bougie looking or not, said farmed. And I wouldn't eat farmed salmon because in the past I've read that the saturated fat levels are much higher and that it has a kind of undesirable balance between omega-3 and omega-6, which just isn't as good for you. And I believe that there are about 4 times the numbers of omega-6s compared to omega-3s when you compare farmed to wild salmon. The next thing is that I also believed, right, before I did my research, that farmed salmon was injected with dye, right? This is not true. However, it is fed a pigment, right? That same pigment is found in crustaceans because wild salmon eat a lot of shrimp and so on as they're swimming about the ocean, munching away, and that turns the flesh that lovely pink or red color. So this blows my mind because they are feeding this pigment to farmed salmon to make it look like wild salmon, which seems to me, you know, when I think about, as I always do, things in a philosophical way, that we're just eating simulated salmon. So it's, you know, really the fish industry knows that we know what salmon looks like. So they feed it things to make us think that it's the thing that we think it is. I would call this ethically questionable on the grounds that you're using our expectations to fool us, to make us believe that one thing is another thing. This pigment, which is called canthaxanthin, has now also been restricted or limited in the amount in the feed by the European Union. Now, Scotland, you know, is part of the United Kingdom, which used to be part of the EU, but no longer. So these restrictions from the EU don't apply here. But the reason the EU have restricted this canthaxanthin pigment being fed to the fish is that there is evidence that the pigments actually over time accumulate on the retina and then affect your eyesight. Not really that the salmon industry care though, because Scottish Quality Salmon Board, their communications spokesperson, Julie Edgar, said, "It's appealing to the eye. People traditionally associate salmon with pink and red." I love that, traditionally associate. What you mean is salmon is pink and red. There's no such thing as zero risk. We do know that there's a possible impact in the long term on eyesight, but it's impossible to quantify it. So we're just going to keep doing it. You know, lovely caring words there from the people responsible for the safety of the things I put in my mouth. All right. So far, we have a health concern from the pigmentation, which is being used to fool us into thinking we have the same salmon that we could go fish out of a river somewhere. And we have a less optimal omega-6 to omega-3 ratio and higher saturated fats. Is there anything else that I should be concerned about with regards to farmed salmon? Yes, there is. More ethics. So farmed salmon live out their lives in pens. These pens contain up to 100,000 fish. This means, because they're all restricted in a small area, that they're constantly bumping into each other. This causes painful skin lesions, which means they're then fed antibiotics. And actually, on average, 40% of the fish die before reaching maturity. This doesn't happen in the wild. And those that do get to maturity are often subjected to cruel deaths. Their gills are cut open or ripped out while they're still conscious, resulting in a painful and cruel death. Undercover footage in Scotland found that over 60% of the farms were employing methods of killing that caused unnecessary suffering, including farms that were certified, believe it or not, by the RSPCA, which is the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. On these farms, fish were left to suffocate out of the water for over 3 minutes. The guidelines are that the fish should not be out of water for more than 15 seconds. The same farms also drop, I can't remember the name of it, but there's basically fish that they put in with the salmon whose job it is to try and eat parasites off of the salmon's bodies because, again, they're always bumping into each other in this crowded environment and passing these parasites onto each other, which is obviously very bad for the fish. And these same farms were also caught on drone by whistleblowers hiding and removing tons of dead fish just hours before a politician came to visit. Well, sounds weird. Okay. So all this blew my mind because if I had previously been asked if I thought salmon was a healthy protein, I would absolutely have said yes. I had no idea that line-caught Atlantic salmon was banned in Scotland, and that all of the Scottish salmon sold in supermarkets here, and I guess elsewhere in the world, is actually farmed. Yes, it does say it on the label, but realistically, how many people are reading that? How many people are like me and go through their life as skeptical nihilists and then go fact check everything that they see, hear, or read? It's a curse. But, you know, I've definitely decided I'm not going to be buying any Scottish salmon at all. And we'll be checking at any breakfast place I go to on the provenance of the fish before having a salmon and cream cheese bagel. You can get non-farmed wild salmon here in Scotland, but it's not Scottish. You can get Alaskan salmon for sure, and I'd have to check up on the status of Norwegian salmon, but I know also Icelandic salmon is line caught and wild. But then when I do that, I then open up another can of worms because then I'm concerned about the carbon footprint situation and climate change. So, all right, what exactly is the point of this week's episode? I often ask myself this. I feel like I just do a brain dump every week. Well, it's to provoke thought about what the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard calls simulacra and simulation. For those of you that enjoy Easter eggs in movies, in the scene in the film The Matrix, when Neo is in his apartment at night and Morpheus sends him a message that says, knock, knock. People knock on his door and he says, follow the white rabbit. Well, Neo gets a book from his bookshelf, and that book is Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation, which the directors of the film, who are now the Wachowski sisters, basically made that essential reading for the crew. I'm not sure how that would have gone, because even as someone very used to reading these very abstract ideas and the way that philosophers write, I found that book extremely heavy going. But the gist of it is that current society has replaced all meaning and reality with symbols and signs, and that a human experience is a simulation of reality. And the simulacra that Baudrillard refers to are the significations and symbolism of culture and media that construct our perceived reality, the acquired understanding by which human life and shared existence are rendered legible. I would argue for the case that something like the farmed salmon being fed pigmentation to trick us into the assumption it's no different from wild salmon is what Baudrillard referred to in the book as second-order simulacra, which are symbols of a non-faithful representation of an original item. Here, signs and images don't faithfully show reality, but hint towards the existence of something real that the sign itself is incapable of encapsulating. So, a few weeks or so ago, I also responded to a listener email that had made the claim that clients are responsible for due diligence on what they get in a gym. And my pushback on that was that you cannot expect a non-sophisticated user to understand the data, even if they have it. And the onus is on the entity giving us the information to make it clear and transparent. And I think this falls under the scope of the same argument. Nobody has time to walk around the supermarket checking labels and then reading or trying to understand white papers and government reports. Therefore, the companies themselves that create these products are responsible for ensuring they're not creating a simulacra of reality. It's really very dystopian that we're living in a time where there are more simulated items than there are real items. because it's cheaper for companies to make fake representations of real items than it is to continue with the real items themselves. I would further argue that it fails on ethical grounds. You should not be misled into thinking that what you have is a real item and not a copy of a real item. To me, wellness and fitness is all about having free will to make healthy choices. It's very reasonable to assume that salmon would be a healthy choice, but farmed salmon? Definitely less so. So what's the answer here? Because these companies are not going to stop, and you're not going to go and do deep dive research into every single thing that you encounter in your life. So I don't really know what the answer is, but what I do know is it's a good place to start just having the conversation. Now, as usual, if you have any questions or just want to say hi, you can email me at getfitguy@quickanddirtytips.com, which is a podcast by Quick and Dirty Tips. Thanks to the team at Quick and Dirty Tips, Morgan Christensen, Holly Hutchins, Brandon Getchus, Davina Tomlin. If you have a question, you can voicemail me, 510-353-3104. Email me, getfitguy@quickanddirtytips.com. Check out quickanddirtytips.com or check out the show notes in your podcast app. Goodbye.